All right, everyone. Hello, and welcome to the first screencast for Chapter 20. In Chapter 20, we're going to be talking about the phenomena of unemployment. A couple big questions that we're going to address here in Chapter 20. The first is, what are the major reasons for unemployment? Turns out to be several different causes of overall unemployment, and so we're going to define those and talk about what contributes to those different types of unemployment. And then the second big question we're going to talk about is, what can we learn from official unemployment data? It turns out official unemployment data is only one way of thinking about underemployment in the economy overall. So we're going to talk about the pros and cons of the official number, and we're going to look at a couple of alternative numbers that may give us a more holistic view of unemployment and underemployment in an economy. So let's start out by thinking about something that most of us are familiar with, and that's the Great Recession, 2007, 2008, 2009. Why was unemployment so high during the Great Recession? Well, certain industries were hit particularly hard. Of course, housing was kind of at the heart of the entire Great Recession. So certainly in housing, there was a lot, that industry took a really heavy hit. There was a huge reduction in demand for housing. There was probably an oversupply of housing by many measures. And so that particular industry, there were lots of jobs lost in that industry. Also, after the recession, the way that unemployment responds to different shocks to the macroeconomy sometimes can lag. The corrections don't happen as immediate in the employment labor sector as it does in other parts of the economy, like, say, in finance or something like that, or in the stock market, where you see people immediately react to negative macroeconomic shocks. Sometimes with unemployment, these things take time to show up in the official numbers. Another could be that government policy could have contributed to the unemployment during the Great Recession. Different unintended consequences of different government programs can lengthen unemployment at times. And then, of course, how unemployment is measured. If you're not looking for a job, and we're going to get into the technical definition of this in a bit, but if you're not actively seeking a job, you're usually not counted as being unemployed. And so that's done for good reasons, but it has some weird side effects in that if someone has been out of work for so long and they just get completely discouraged, now they're suddenly not counted as being unemployed, which if you're trying to measure unemployment to say how healthy is the economy overall, that might seem like a weird thing, because obviously a person who is so discouraged that they've stopped working, that's bad in the macroeconomic economy sense of things. It's bad certainly for that worker and their family, but they're no longer counted as unemployed. So anyways, we're going to come back to that in a bit when we really dig into exactly how unemployment is measured. But these are just, I think the recent recession is a good way to start thinking about how unemployment works and how the different measures of it can be revealing and misleading in some ways about the health of the economy. So this is what the U.S. unemployment rate has looked like since 1965. So you can see there's unemployment was around 5% at the start of the series. And then there were a couple episodes here of in the late 70s, in the early to mid 80s, early 90s. And then, of course, we have the Great Recession here, where there was a big spike up in unemployment. So you can see what looks kind of like a cycle. It's cyclical in some ways, and we're going to come back to this cyclical nature of unemployment in just a minute. So first of all, let's think about unemployment in just the common sense of the term, the fact that people can't find jobs, right? Well, is it practical to have zero unemployment? First of all, would that be a desirable thing to have? And would it be practical? Would it be worthwhile to pursue policies that would try to get us to zero unemployment? Well, economists think that generally unemployment is undesirable, certainly. We don't want to have people who want jobs who cannot find jobs. But the economy is it's like a rainforest is the metaphor I like to use. And so everything is constantly changing and adapting within an economy. It's what scientists call a complex system. And complex systems often have strange interactions in the way things emerge and bubble up. It's a moving system. It's like a hurricane. There's a lot of parts that interact in different ways. And so we may not want to have zero unemployment if that in the long run hurts something about this economic rainforest, this system that is this highly interconnected, highly adaptive social system. Having zero unemployment may actually make things worse. And that's not to say that we don't want people to be able to find jobs, but pursuing government policies to the extent that it would give us zero unemployment, that actually might be too much. It actually might harm the economy, and we're going to dig into that in this chapter. So what we're going to do is we're going to define 3 different types of unemployment, and some of these are going to be worse than others in terms of the way economists think about these. And so some of these types we're going to want to go to zero, but other types it may be detrimental for those types of unemployment to go to zero. And so the 3 types we're going to define through the next few slides are structural unemployment, frictional unemployment, and cyclical unemployment. And just spoiler alert, it's this last one that economists worry the most about in terms of how it affects the economy in a negative way. So first, let's start with structural unemployment. So what is structural unemployment? Well, it's unemployment that's caused by changes in the industrial makeup of the economy. So as businesses close, as the economy evolves, as things adapts, some workers are going to lose their jobs. Joseph Schumpeter called this creative destruction. This is what makes modern market economies so dynamic and so responsive, and what makes them ultimately have higher growth rates than less dynamic market economies or economies that are not market economies. It's because the profit motive of firms seeking profits, of employees seeking the highest pay possible, of consumers trying to get the best quality goods at the lowest possible prices, all of that competition, some businesses fail. Some technologies become outdated. And so that causes unemployment as a part of that creative destruction of the economy as a whole. But again, that's a sign of a growing, healthy economy. The fact that things that are less efficient die off, companies that are less efficient die off, and that newer companies and entrepreneurs are constantly trying to find new and novel solutions to problems. That's all good and healthy. Now, one of the downsides is that workers lose their jobs. Managers sometimes lose their jobs, though not as often as workers. But that's all part of a healthy growing economy. This structural unemployment is something that we're going to see even in a very robust growing economy. An example would be Borders Bookstore that went through bankruptcy in 2011. There were significant job losses in not just Borders, but in the entire book industry in terms of retail stores and in terms of the publishing industry. So, and why is that? What's causing these bookstores to go out of business? Well, it's Amazon. Amazon has a business model that consumers seem to prefer. They have lower overhead. They don't have to have these storefronts with lots and lots of retail workers. And so Borders going out of business caused unemployment of those employees. But it's not the kind of unemployment where it's seen by economists as a wholly negative thing. It certainly is negative when people lose their job. But we wouldn't want to prevent this type of unemployment completely. Because that would mean keeping Borders in business, maybe through subsidies or some sort of government program that kept Borders in business so that those workers could have jobs. That's not generally what we would want to do because it would ultimately hurt consumers and it would ultimately hurt the growth of the economy as a whole. Another example is steel production. Steel production has become way more efficient and safer. Advanced engineering techniques have made it possible for firms to replace workers with equipment. That causes unemployment. So in 1980 in the U.S. there were about 500,000 laborers working in the steel industry. Now there's about 150,000. So a big reduction in the number of employees in the U.S. steel industry. Some of that is due to U.S. steel companies being outcompeted by companies from outside of the U.S., but a lot of it is due to the increasing use of capital and machines to replace workers. The consequence is that steel manufacturing today is far, far safer than it was, say, in 1980. But we need fewer workers to work in that industry. And those trade-offs between safety and the number of workers is reflected in the employment numbers for that particular industry. So over the course of most economies, developing economies, you start out with people working in primarily agricultural industries. Then those economies move to where people are working in manufacturing, working in factories, and then ultimately what we end up is with people working in offices or working online. So we go from a agricultural type economy to a office kind of economy. Literally, the office here is the picture the textbook author chose for this particular slide. That's the U.S. television show, The Office. So this has been kind of the evolution of the U.S. economy, and it's been the evolution in many developed economies. So the U.S. today is primarily a service economy. Most people, as I mentioned in some previous lectures, most people in the U.S. work in some version of the service economy. What I'm doing right now, this is part of the service economy. I'm not manufacturing anything. I worked in high school and just out of high school in a assembly line plant. I made those little spigots, those frost-free spigots that you see out like by a field with cattle or something. I sat on a machine and made those for hours and hours a day. But now what I do is more part of the service economy, and that's indeed what's happened overall in the U.S. So this is starting in 1800, and what this is 100% of the workforce. So that's how you read this graph. And so what proportion of that 100% works in these three different categories, these three different types of industries? So you can see 1800, highly agricultural economy in the U.S., almost over 90% of workers were working in agriculture. And then suddenly, as the Industrial Revolution takes hold, we get more and more industry, and we get more and more people working in different service economies. And now the large majority of workers in the U.S. are working in the service industry of some sort, and only a tiny, tiny fraction of the U.S. workforce is working in agriculture. So all of this is, again, that part of that creative destruction. We wouldn't want to impede this process, right? Because throughout this process, we're talking about higher paying jobs. We're talking about lower cost for consumer goods, lower cost for durable goods. We're talking about higher yields in agriculture. Even though a tiny fraction of people working in agriculture, we grow and make a lot more stuff in the agriculture industry in the U.S. than we did back in 1800. So we wouldn't want to impede this sort of progress just to prevent unemployment, even though unemployment is an unintended consequence, undesirable consequence of this creative destruction of the economy as a whole. So it would be undesirable to try to save jobs that were obsolete or inefficient. So what do we do about structural unemployment? It's not that it's a good thing. It's still a bad thing. Well, workers who are in these industries that either the entire industry becomes obsolete or a particular company within an industry becomes obsolete or inefficient or is outcompeted, workers must retrain. They have to re-educate. They'll have to relocate at times, and they might have to change some of their expectations about work and pay. And government programs can come in and help with those different types of training programs, relocation subsidies, things that help people get back to work when there's major structural changes in different industries. So let's think about a historic case of people who tried to prevent the creative destruction within a healthy economy. And these people were known as Luddites. You may think of Luddites now as people who just don't like technology. They don't like computers. They're not on Facebook, right? That's a Luddite. Someone with a flip phone instead of a smartphone or something like that. We'd say, oh, you're a Luddite. Well, what Luddites were originally is they were 19th century English textile workers. And they would destroy automated looms, things that made textiles, machines that made textiles, in order to try to keep their jobs. And they would throw wooden shoes, they would throw things into these looms as a form of almost like industrial terrorism of sorts, and trying to keep companies from becoming more automated and more mechanized in order to protect their jobs. And something I learned when preparing these slides is this was named after a guy named Ned Ludd. So Luddites were people who held this guy Ned Ludd in high esteem. And apparently he had destroyed a couple of these different looms to make stockings, maybe about, I think the Wikipedia said 30 years before the Luddites came about. But so this guy was kind of like a legend. There was a mythology about him that was told amongst these workers that we ought to do what old Ned Ludd did and go in and destroy these machines that are taking our jobs. All right, but obviously, if you were to do that, that's going to slow down the modernization of the economy as a whole, and it's going to keep prices high for textiles. Yeah, and of course, I already said this. Their goal was to protect themselves from structural unemployment. They didn't want their company or their type of job within the industry to be made obsolete. So they were trying to prevent that by destroying these machines. But a question to think about is, the Industrial Revolution left many people structurally unemployed. In fact, it was a pretty terrible time overall for most people who weren't elites. The Industrial Revolution, this is when Karl Marx wrote the Communist Manifesto and Das Kapital, because it looked like this capitalism thing was going to be pretty horrible for most people, because a lot of these workers were losing their jobs, and there was nothing else that they could do, nothing they knew how to do. Many of them had moved from agricultural areas as those types of jobs went away and moved into cities, and now they were unemployed, living in dirty cities with lots of pollution. And Marx and Engels came along and looked at this and said, wow, this capitalism thing is going to be terrible. It's going to destroy itself, and we need a different system. Turns out he was right about a lot of the symptoms about what he was seeing, but he was writing at a time right before all of the gains from the Industrial Revolution started being dispersed amongst people, and consumer goods got radically cheaper for the common person. And of course, that spawned new industries with new technologies that those workers could be employed in. And so overall, it ended up being a good thing. But what if the Luddites or Marx or whoever had gotten their way and we had stopped that progress of the Industrial Revolution and kept things still in terms of lots and lots of labor being required to manufacture different types of goods? Well, we would all have much lower standards of living now if that were the case, if nothing was mechanized and everything was made by hand. And so we don't generally want to stop the progress in these economies just to fix unemployment. There may be other ways, other government programs, social safety net, different ways of trying to help those who are structurally unemployed while still letting the economy and the markets do their magic in terms of giving us all cheaper goods, higher standards of living, and higher paying jobs for lots of folks. So there are different trade-offs here with technological progress and structural unemployment. And as I already said all this, but just so you can have it here on your slides, technology makes things cheaper, more efficient. We don't want to stop that process. We don't want to replace those more efficient and fast processes with slower, labor-intensive processes just to help with structural unemployment. There's better ways for the economy as a whole to help with structural unemployment. So the next type of unemployment I want to talk about is frictional unemployment. So frictional unemployment is caused by time delays in matching people with jobs, in terms of firms finding the right worker for the right job. People don't always want to accept the first job offer that they get. They may want to see what's out there. Firms, on the other hand, don't always want to hire the first employee that they find that is able to do the job. So An example of this is recent college graduates. And in fact, as we're going to see later on, recent college grads are not counted as unemployed until they've been out of college for a while. If they continue to search for a job and aren't able to find one, then they are counted as unemployed. But a recent college grad is not counted because sometimes it takes some time. When you graduate in May, sometimes you may not find that first job for a month or two. So those people are unemployed in the frictional sense, the frictional unemployment sense. Then another might be a spouse of a person who moves to a new job. So sometimes one spouse or the other spouse is offered a job in a new city, and so they'll take that job, and the spouse moves along with them, and it may take the spouse a week, a month, 3 or 4 months to find a job that matches their skills and their salary requirements. So that's another example of something like that's called frictional unemployment. The length of frictional unemployment tends to be short, and it's been getting shorter and shorter as the internet has decreased the time and cost associated with job searching. To take that spouse example from the last slide, with the past few times that I've moved, and it's usually my job that requires us to move because there's only so many colleges and so many places in the U.S., my spouse had a job when we showed up because she was able to use the internet to search for jobs, to interview beforehand. So frictional unemployment is becoming less and less of an issue as the internet has lowered search costs for both firms and employees in terms of finding firms. Frictional unemployment can also be made bigger or smaller when it's affected by different government regulations that may make it difficult to hire or fire. We see this in the U.S. state by state where there are different laws in terms of how hard or easy it is for firms to hire or fire employees. But we definitely will see it when comparing the U.S. to other countries. We're going to talk about later on in this chapter Spain, which has rules that make it very, very difficult to fire someone if you've hired them for a certain amount of time. And so this makes companies very, very hesitant to hire someone. And so they will put people on when they're allowed to, they'll put people on temporary contracts. They'll wait a very long time before they hire another employee. So frictional unemployment can be exacerbated by government regulations at times. Some of the consequences of this are that this is one of the reasons that the government created unemployment insurance. So this provides income to workers who are laid off, provides people time to find a new job, prevents economic problems from spilling over into other industries. So if one particular industry has some frictional or structural unemployment, sometimes that can bleed out into other industries. If suddenly a lot of people lose their job in a particular area, that can hurt a store in that particular area. When that store goes out, that causes more people to lose their job. So there can be spillover effects from particular industries. So unemployment insurance, either that which is provided, the short term provided by government, or you can buy unemployment insurance policies that protect you against this sort of thing. They provide a buffer against those sorts of downsides. The downside of unemployment insurance is that it can reduce your incentives to find a job quickly. So if you are getting payments from your unemployment insurance, you may not take a job as quickly. Now, in general, that's going to be probably a good thing because you're going to get a better match with a firm. But it can also make people take longer than they otherwise would if they didn't have that sort of insurance. So this is that graph I was talking about in terms of Spain. And so here you can see this is unemployment in the U.S. and Spain starting in 1995, going to 2015. And this has been adjusted to make these numbers comparable. Spain doesn't calculate their official unemployment in the exact same way as the U.S., but for this data, they've been calculated the same way. And so these numbers are comparable to one another. So you can see Spain starts out with drastically higher unemployment, but it falls rapidly. But notice it still never quite gets to the low levels of the U.S. In fact, the lowest unemployment that Spain has had is just barely below the highest unemployment the United States has had. And the big reason for this gap is the different regulations that they have in terms of hiring and firing people. It's very difficult to fire someone who you've, say, employed for a year or more in Spain. And that's just true in several different older Western European countries where they have very, very restrictive labor contracts. And so this makes companies very hesitant to hire. And so when someone does lose their job, it takes quite a while for people to be able to find new employment. Now we're going to get to the worst type of unemployment here. This is called cyclical unemployment. This is the really bad stuff. There's maybe an upside of sorts to structural unemployment because we're letting the creative destruction of the economy happen. We're not impeding that growth. We're not impeding companies finding new solutions, making things safer. We're not stopping that. So even though unemployment's bad, maybe structural unemployment is just something we have to live with because we don't want to prevent it altogether. Cyclical unemployment, on the other hand, is generally thought of as just a bad thing. And it's caused by economic downturns. When the economy goes south and companies close, not because they've been outcompeted by another company, not because their technology was obsolete, not for any of those reasons in terms of a robust economy, but because the economy is not robust, because there's been a recession or something like that. And so companies go out of business for those macroeconomic reasons. So an example would be the unemployment caused by the Great Recession itself. So when the housing market collapsed, a lot of people in the housing market lose their job. Then the financial sector gets hit. A lot of people lose their job in the financial sector. And then as it ripples out, tax revenues go down. So a lot of people hired by the government, a lot of people hired by universities. I happen to have been on the job market during the Great Recession, and there were not a lot of positions to be had because the overall economic downturn had hurt both private and public colleges. So this is generally unambiguously bad, a bad type of unemployment. In 2008, on average, it took people 18 months to find jobs, and 10%. We had a 10% unemployment rate in the U.S. So those are the three types of unemployment. So another way that you will hear unemployment talked about, so the first kind of taxonomy of unemployment, ways of categorizing different types of unemployment were structural, frictional, and cyclical. All right. Another way that we can divide up the total unemployment pie, if you will, is to think about natural unemployment, which is unemployment that is going to happen in a functioning, growing, healthy economy because of the different sorting and the adaptation and that creative destruction is going to cause unemployment, but it's part of a otherwise healthy economy. We call that the natural rate of unemployment. And so how do we think about that natural rate of unemployment? Well, it's the typical rate in a healthy economy. All right. And so in a second, I'm going to put up a little bar chart and talk about this part of unemployment is the natural rate, and this part is not the natural rate. And we really want to focus on getting rid of the part that's not the natural rate. At the natural rate of unemployment, there's an output or a GDP associated with that. Remember Y equals C plus I plus G from the previous chapter in chapter 19. Well, the Y associated, the output in the economy associated with the natural rate of unemployment is, we're going to call that Y star. So it's the full employment output level. It's the output by an economy that has no cyclical unemployment. So cyclical unemployment is going to be the unnatural type of employment, and the natural rate of unemployment is going to be the frictional and the structural unemployment. And so here's a good picture for your notes as you're studying. This is all of possible unemployment, say during a recession. So you have the frictional, new college graduates, spouses who are moving, people who are just temporarily not quite able to find the job that's the right fit. Then there's structural unemployment caused by the natural ebb and flow within an economy. Companies go out of business, employees lose their job, and they search, they find another job. That's structural unemployment. But this is the part caused by the fact that the macroeconomy is just not doing very well. Businesses are going bankrupt, and people are losing their job. That's this cyclical part, all right? And so this would be unemployment during normal macroeconomic conditions, and we would call that the natural level of unemployment. This is just part of the shifting and the ebb and flow of the economy. At any one snapshot in time, some people are going to be out of work for structural and frictional reasons, but they're going to find jobs eventually. It's not that the economy is doing poorly, and that's what's causing them to be unemployed. So how is the natural rate of unemployment and output related? Well, when the economy is healthy and the unemployment rate equals the natural unemployment rate, meaning there's none of that cyclical unemployment, so unemployment in the economy equals the natural rate, then the output in the economy will equal the full employment or the natural unemployment rate of output. Cyclical unemployment is 0. When cyclical unemployment is positive, the real unemployment rate has more in it than is the natural rate of unemployment. So it's U star, the natural rate, plus cyclical would equal the unemployment rate. So just the unemployment rate on its own is bigger than the natural rate of unemployment. That means the output in the economy is lower than the full employment or the natural rate of unemployment level of output. So cyclical unemployment hurts the overall output in the economy and drives us below the full employment rate of output, or the natural unemployment rate of output. People say it both ways. So a supernormal expansion in the economy, the unemployment rate might fall below the natural rate of unemployment. Jobs may be, workers may be so in demand that even people who don't quite find the right fit of a job might be paid enough to get them to just do the job. And so unemployment, the real unemployment rate in the economy, may actually fall below this, what economists call the natural or the full employment level, or the natural unemployment level. Output in the economy will be even higher than the full employment rate of output, or the natural unemployment rate of output in the economy. So this cyclical unemployment is actually negative here, because the economy is doing so well that some people who would normally be structurally or frictionally unemployed are now being employed. So I want to end this screencast, this first screencast of Chapter 20, with a little sample multiple choice question. So which of the following people is structurally unemployed? Alfred, the VCR salesman, he's unemployed because there are a few people who still want VCRs. Macy, the construction worker, she's unemployed because no one is building houses right now. And then Lucinda, the restaurant chef, is unemployed because he and his wife recently moved to a new city. Well, this one is that frictional unemployment, the spouse moving with a spouse moving with their spouse to a new city, and it just takes them some time to find a job. This one, Macy, the construction worker, is unemployed because no one's building houses. That sounds like cyclical unemployment to me. A downturn in the economy has caused someone to be unemployed. And so it's this first one. Alfred, the VCR repairman, is unemployed because people don't want VCRs anymore. I doubt many of you have VCRs. It's an outdated technology, and so there's very little demand for people in those jobs anymore. So that's an example of that structural unemployment. So that is the end of the screencast for the first screencast for Chapter 20. Don't go away, there's one more. And so we'll move along now to looking at exactly how is the unemployment rate, that number we hear on the news, how is that calculated, and what are some of the pros and cons. That's all up next in Screencast 2.